Hi, my name is Pat, and this is my channel, Book Chat with Pat, and I'm glad that you're here. This past week has been week 2 of Rocket Summer, an event created by Michael K. Vaughan, in which we are reading classic science fiction from the 19th century through 1969 during the month of July. There is a group of co-hosts whose names I will list in the notes below. I'm delighted to be a co-host in this event. This week, week 2, was devoted to classic science fiction from the 1940s. I started the week off by reading 3 short stories by 3 different female writers. Early female writers to the genre. I read from both Volume 1, The Future is Female, 25 Classic Science Fiction Stories by Women. And this is a Library of America edition. There are 2 volumes to this series. I read from here, and I read from Sisters of Tomorrow, the first women of science fiction. The stories I read really were a mixed bag. First, I read Leslie Perri's 1941 story entitled Space Episode. The story was first published in the rather clunky titled magazine Future Combined with Science Fiction, a combination of 2 magazines, and it was later reprinted in the May 1954 edition of Space Facts and Fiction. This is a story about a co-ed crew, a space expedition of 2 men and 1 woman who are trying to return to Earth when their rocket encounters a swarm of meteors that damages one of the forward-facing rocket nozzles, the tubes that determine whether they are going to be able to land safely or crash in a blaze. So the central conflict of the story is between the crew members to determine who is going to leave the rocket to try to unblock the nozzles so that the rocket can land safely. It is almost guaranteed that the person who leaves the rocket is sacrificing him or herself for the good of the crew. It was an interesting concept, but the entire plot seemed implausible, and the dialogue between the characters was stilted and sometimes laughable. Some of the action, which is meant to be dramatic, also came off as almost comical. Leda, the one female aboard the ship, says, "Eric, damn it, this is not a tea party. We have to do something now." Leda soon begins this maniacal laughter, prompting Michael to say to her, "Stop laughing, stop it." He covered his face with his hands, and Leda felt sick. Moments later, she darted over to Michael and struck him sharply across the face. He looked up suddenly, his eyes widening in amazement. "Aren't you going to say goodbye?" Leda asks him. Apparently, the story caused all kinds of friction and controversy in the letters section of the magazine, with many male consumers writing in about how absurd the story was, and a few females writing in to praise it. One guy wrote, "Of all the hacky, sour, limping stories, this tops them all. Bah! Triple bah!" A woman then wrote in to say that this was good, fine, and super. Call it loyalty to my sex, or what you will, but I still like it best. It was swell. More. A second story that I read When You Think That, Smile by Dorothy, Louise, Lestina was published in the February 1943 issue of Future Fantasy and Science Fiction. This is a story of the thought variant style of science fiction. Here, the narrator of the story realizes that he has been granted this very special power, this extrasensory perception, where he now has the ability to read the minds of anyone he comes in contact with. And he discovers this one evening when he suddenly realizes what his wife, Martha, is thinking. And he begins to berate her for the thoughts that she is having about his mother, her mother-in-law, thoughts that she clearly has never said out loud. The husband suddenly feels all powerful with this new gift that he has acquired, and he leaves the house and he wanders out into the night, reading people's minds as he comes upon them, and feeling at first quite amused by this new gift, and then also very superior to others. Eventually, though, he comes to understand where this gift has come from. And he also realizes that if he continues to use it, he is going to lose those nearest and dearest to him. Most importantly, his wife, Martha. The third story that I read, entitled That Only a Mother by Judith Merrill, was originally published in the June 1948 edition of Astounding Science Fiction. This was the best of the three stories and also the most disturbing. It takes place in 1953 during World War III, which has caused extensive radiation poisoning from the use of nuclear bombs. This has led to a rash of birth defects, and only a few pregnancies actually result in normal births. So this is the story of a couple, Margaret and Hank, who are expecting their first baby while Hank is away on a military assignment. Part of the story deals with Margaret's fears for her unborn child. Eventually, she gives birth to a baby girl, Henrietta. A lot of this story takes place in letters that she's writing to Hank. The story continues with Margaret writing to Hank about their baby daughter that he has not seen. And she describes what a precocious child Henrietta is. She does indeed develop physically and intellectually at a very rapid pace. I don't want to say any more about the story because I don't want to, it's a very short story and I don't want to give it away. It's a haunting and powerful story that will stay with me for a long time. Of the three, this is the one that I would recommend to anyone interested in reading early science fiction written by women. It is considered one of the most anthologized stories of science fiction of the 20th century. It's also been published in the Science Fiction Hall of Fame, Volume 1, 1929 to 1964. This is a total aside, but in my reading of these stories and in my research, I discovered that all three of these women were married at one time to Frederick Pohl, the science fiction writer and editor of several science fiction magazines, including Astonishing Stories, Super Science Stories, and Galaxy. So what's that all about? They would go on to marry other people. He would go on to have 2 more wives after these 3. I also wanted to read some Robert A. Heinlein for this week devoted to the 1940s. Some time ago, I had responded to a video on Heinlein that was made by my friend and co-host Grammaticus Books. And I asked him where would he suggest that I start with Heinlein as a person who is totally new to science fiction. He said that he actually thought that the stories written for teens might be a good place to start with Heinlein. So at that time, and this was several months ago, I acquired a very old copy of Have Space Suit Will Travel, which is actually the last one written in this series. It is certainly very dated, and the diction in the dialogue, it's corny. That would be how I would describe it. But I also really enjoyed the story, and after I read that, I acquired a couple more from a used bookseller. I had a lot of fun this week reading 2 additional novels from Heinlein's juvenile series. This is a series that was written most likely for young teen boys, before there was such a thing as young adult or YA fiction. I read the first one that he wrote in the series, Rocket Ship Galileo, and this was written in 1947. Just look at that cover. And I also read Space Cadet, which is number 2 in the series, and this was written in 1948. Scribner's published a total of 12 novels in the juvenile series between 1947 and 1958. The intended market was clearly teenaged boys. They are standalone books, and the characters do not carry over from one book to another. But they do tell a story of space exploration and of the expansion of humanity across the solar system. I've talked many times about how I am new to the science fiction genre. Reading these books intended for a young audience, I was thinking that I probably would have loved them when I was a young person. I think I would have really, as a kid in junior high school or maybe late elementary school, I think I would have loved these books. I don't ever remember seeing these or hearing about them. I don't know if boys were reading these when I was growing up in the 60s, but I know that I never heard about these. And I think that, at least in the 60s, I don't think science fiction was a genre that, I can't say it wasn't open to girls, but I don't ever remember being exposed to any books in this genre. And I think that's too bad. I think I would have loved these as a kid. So I love them now as a senior citizen. Anyway, the first in the series, the rocket ship Galileo, begins with 3 teenaged boys who are testing their own homemade rocket that they have built. And they're doing this test in one of the boys' backyards. The uncle of one of the boys, a friendly scientist named Dr. Cargraves, who also happened to be a physicist working on the Manhattan Project, he comes along and he's very impressed by his nephew and his nephew's friends, and he eventually enlists these boys in his project, which is putting together a spaceship the Galileo and going to the moon, where they set up a semi-permanent base and claim the moon on behalf of the United Nations. There's actually a very, very moving scene where they plant a flag and make that declaration. However, while on the moon, the boys discover that there is also a Nazi base on the moon. They find evidence of an earlier lunar civilization. They believe they have found evidence of an alien race that was destroyed by nuclear bombs. It's very clear that this novel is the product of the early post-World War II years. Its politics are very clearly those of World War II. This is definitely pre-Cold War. And it was also written well before the space race began. The technical aspects of building this rocket and taking off and flying to the moon felt a little bit more to me like the book I read last week, H.G. Wells' The Time Machine. It didn't feel like it belonged in the 19th century, but it felt more like a book from that kind of knowledge of how one would go about building a rocket. More that than I think some of the things that might have come out of the space race, for instance. I have not read any mature Heinlein. So I have no idea what's to come, except what I have, learned from my friends' videos. I haven't read anything else myself. But I did think that this first book in the juvenile series was just a lot of fun. The second book in the juvenile series, Space Cadet, from 1948, is a military academy story transferred to outer space. The main character is Matt Dodson, and he joins the Interplanetary Patrol to help preserve peace in the solar system. The year is 2075, and Matt Dodson has been accepted to the Academy after a series of rigorous tests. Although the Space Patrol is militaristic in its structure, it really is a peacekeeping organization. Matt makes some good friends and one not so good friend, one kind of enemy, at the Academy. And together they go on a number of missions. One is to search for a missing research vessel, the Pathfinder. Another is to investigate an incident that occurred on Venus, where they discover a legendary ship that was thought to be lost. This is a ship that was lost 100 years earlier. They do exciting things. The characters are not super well developed. I wouldn't call them exactly one-dimensional, but they're fairly flat. But the coming of age theme is very clear. This is a book about boys who enter the Space Academy, who become men who are going to keep the world safe. The novel conveys a terrific sense of adventure. Like the others that I've read in the series, I found it to be a lot of fun as well. I understand that this book prefigures Heinlein's later, much more famous novel meant for an older audience, Starship Troopers. But I haven't read that. I don't know about that. That's one I would have to ask my friend Grammaticus Books to weigh in on, because he knows that book really well and has made terrific videos about it. So I'm going to see what he thinks, if this is a precursor to Starship Troopers. Space Cadet inspired a comic book series by Joseph Green of Grosset and Dunlap, and that was entitled Tom Corbett Space Cadet. This book also inspired a TV series, a radio show, and additional novels that became popular in the 1950s. Just for fun, I did a little search on YouTube to see if I could find any of the TV series Tom Corbett Space Cadet, and it aired from 1950 to 1955, so I thought there was a good chance I'd find them on somebody's YouTube channel, and I think I found the complete series. I have not watched the complete series. I watched a couple of episodes. The episodes were 15 minutes long during the week and a half hour on Saturdays. So I watched a couple of these 15-minute episodes. Really, really low budget, vintage TV, vintage 1950s TV. The Space Cadets, they're supposed to be older teenagers and young adults. In the TV series, they're played by these, there's three of them in most of the episodes, who look like, they look like middle-aged men. They don't look like teenagers or college-age kids. But they were fun, and I had a blast watching just a handful of them. I may revisit some of these next week as we get into vintage science fiction of the 1950s in Rocket Summer. Finally, I am in the middle of George R. Stewart's Earth Abides, and I'm going to finish my discussion of this when I finish the novel, but I didn't want to leave it out of this video because it's also packing a very powerful emotional punch. This novel was written by George R. Stewart in 1949. I will either make a separate video about the novel or I'll tack it on to 1950s next week, but I've got a ton of stuff to read for the 1950s. This is a really powerful, brilliant post-apocalyptic novel showing the ravages of an unprecedented plague upon the human race. It opens in this haunting way. I'm just going to read a couple of passages from the book, describing the contagion, or a contagion that could bring about the destruction of the human race. I just want to read the opening to the book. This is really like an epigraph at the very beginning. Well, actually, it starts with men go and come, but earth abides, which is from Ecclesiastes. But just before that, nope, just after that, sorry. It starts 1. World without end. If a killing type of virus strain should suddenly arise by mutation, it could, because of the rapid transportation in which we indulge nowadays, be carried to the far corners of the earth and cause the deaths of millions of people. W.M. Stanley in Chemical and Engineering News, December 22nd, 1947. The novel then follows the main character, Isherwood Williams, or Ish, as he comes to be known, who has survived the plague, probably due to his having been bitten by a rattlesnake when the disease strikes. When he more or less recovers from his snake bite and emerges from the mountains in California and ventures out into the world again, he discovers that almost everyone is gone, wiped out by a virulent disease. Ish begins to travel across the country, all the way to New York and then back again to California. And on this journey, which makes up part 1 of the book, he discovers small pockets of people that have somehow survived. He observes the absolute devastation and the end of civilization as we know it. He also finds a woman, Emma, and they agree to form a life together. This is moment 0, Ish notes, when time begins again. I'm just going to read something from when he makes that realization. That evening there was no rain. The clouds still hung low, but the air was clear beneath them. You could have seen the lights of San Francisco if there had been any lights. He stood on the porch and looked out toward the dark west, breathing the cool, damp air in deeply. His mood was still close to exaltation. Now we have finished with the past, he thought. These last few months, the tag end of the year, we shall let the past have them. This is the moment 0, and we stand between 2 eras. Now the new life begins. Now we commence the year 1, the year 1. Now there lay before him no longer the mere drama of a world without men and its constant adaptation. No longer would personal readjustment be his own dominating problem. Now there stretched away in the years ahead the unfolding drama of a new society restructuring itself, moving on. And now he would not be the lonely spectator, at least not merely that. He could read. He was equipped with the background of much knowledge already. He would extend that into techniques, into psychology, into political science, if that were needed. There must be others that he could find also to join with them, good people who would help in the new world. He would start looking for people again. He would look craftily, trying to keep away from all those who had suffered too much from the shock, whose minds or bodies were not what one wanted to build up the new society. Somewhere within there lingered still that one deep fear that she might die in childbirth, that the whole hope of the future might thus fade, and yet he could really not fear it very deeply. Her courage burned too brightly. She was life. He could not associate her with death. She was the light for the future, she and those that would spring from her. O Mother of Nations, and her children shall call her blessed. This is where the first part of the novel ends, and this is as far as I got this week. Part 2 begins 22 years later in the future, and we see how the world is or isn't flourishing. I'm fascinated at this point by the protagonist, Ish. George Stewart did not pick his narrator's name casually, as it is laden with historical, biblical, and literary meaning. He is definitely making a connection to the historical figure Ishi, who was believed to be the very last known member of the Native American Yahi people from California. Most of the tribe were killed in a genocide in the 19th century. Ishi was probably born around 1861, and he and his family escaped, and then he lived most of his life in isolation. When he was found in 1911, he was the last remaining member of his tribe. Lacking acquired immunity, he became sick often, frequently, and he died 5 years later in 1916 of tuberculosis. Stewart was probably also thinking of the biblical Ishmael of Genesis. Ishmael was actually the firstborn son of Abraham, a child born from Abraham and his slave, Hagar. He would later have a son, Isaac, with his wife, Sarah. Ishmael and his mother are sent away due to tensions with Abraham's wife, Sarah. The story goes in Genesis that though they were sent to wander in the wilderness, God assured Abraham that Ishmael would also found a nation. He would go on to have 12 sons. And finally, there is the literary Ishmael, Melville's Ishmael in Moby Dick, the single survivor who lives to tell the tale of the murderous worlds of men. So Stewart gives his protagonist this richly symbolic name associated with isolation and exile, but also with survival. So we're starting the 1950s in the coming week in Rocket Summer, and I have plenty to read for that. But I will complete Earth Abides and include my final thoughts about this, either in one of my 1950s videos or in a separate video at some point. So this week spent in science fiction of the 1940s has been very rich indeed for this novice of the genre. As always, I thank you for watching. I hope that you're doing well. I'll speak with you again soon. Take care.